On the edge of the Russian forest, in a small cabin, lived a little girl named Natalia, and she lived with her father. And her mother had died in childbirth, as is the way of many of these stories. No one gets to keep both their parents for long. But she and her father lived a very, very happy life for many, many years. Her father often had to travel for business, and Natalia would go with him on his travels. And on one of these travels, they met a woman who became Natalia's stepmother. Now, the word stepmother conjures up this idea of evil, but this isn't what happened, at least not at first. Natalia's stepmother adored her, her father adored her, and they lived very happily again for many years until the day that Natalia's little sister Draga was born. You know how some children are just challenged by their existence on earth. They have to have their own way. They don't understand why things can't be just the way they want them to be. And sometimes they blame other people for that. Well, Draga was such a child. She wanted things the way she wanted them, and she wore her poor mother down to the point that she essentially just gave Draga whatever she wanted, and she expected Natalia to do the same thing. The years passed. Natalia's life was not quite so happy. Her father had to travel some more. Her stepmother was worn down and unable to resist the sister. And Draga lived as a little terror, well into her teens. One day, when both girls were teenagers, they received an invitation to a ball. And they were both very excited at the idea of going, but Draga drove everybody in the house to their wits' end, trying to make sure everything was perfect. And on the day of the ball, she decided that what she desperately needed to make her dress perfect was a little bouquet of violets. Now, it was winter. There were no violets to be had, but still she insisted that Natalia go out into the forest and look for them. Well, Natalia did her best. She looked and she looked and she looked everywhere in the forest. She dug in the snow at the base of trees to see if perhaps some had just flash frozen there beneath the snow. But alas, she could find none. And she had wandered very far from home. And in fact, she had wandered to what she had always assumed was a mountain in the distance. But it turns out that this mountain appeared to be a mountain on one side, and on the other side there was a straight edge and a platform. And when she came around the corner of that platform, she saw that there were sitting 12 men in a circle around a fire. And she stood and shivered at the edge until they invited her up. And she looked at these men, some of them with long gray beards, and some of them with no beards at all, some of them barely teenagers like herself. And she looked around, frightened at them all, and they told her not to be scared and to come stand close to the fire. And they asked her why she was out in the forest on this chilly day, and she explained what had happened. And the man with the longest, grayest beard, he stood and said, "We can help you, my dear. You shouldn't be wandering by yourself in the forest like this." And he turned to one of the men on his left, and he said, "Brother March, can you help our dear friend Natalia?" And Brother March stood and waved his hands like this, and a small clearing melted in the snow. And in that clearing, some violets grew. And they told Natalia to gather the violets and go bring them back to her sister. And so she did, and she thanked them profusely. And then she went back to her sister and gave her the violets, perhaps making the problem worse by giving in to her and by doing the impossible. But what else could she do? They went off to the ball. They had a wonderful time. Draga's violets were the talk of the whole event. But indeed, Draga had learned a dangerous lesson. For the next morning, when she got up, she said that she needed strawberries, that she wasn't going to be able to live if she couldn't have strawberries. And Natalia, she didn't know what to do. She was worried about how much toll this was taking on her stepmother. She was worried about the toll this might take on her, and she worried what her sister might do if she didn't receive the strawberries. So she went off into the woods, again in search of strawberries. Perhaps she could find frozen strawberries somewhere, but she was trying not to go back to the men. But eventually, even though she tried to stray away, her path somehow led her to this same platform behind the mountain, and the men were happy to see her. And they said, oh, of course we can help you with this. Don't worry at all. You stand by the fire. Brother July, can you help us? And Brother July stood up and waved his hands, and then stars grew from the green that he had exposed, and those stars bloomed into strawberries. And Natalia gathered as many as she could in her apron and went back to her home. And now she had once again done the impossible, and Draga had learned a terrible lesson, that her sister could indeed do things that were impossible, that were difficult, that were in fact ridiculous in the winter. She was satisfied for a couple of days, and then she began to have an intense craving. Draga wanted apples. Now again, Natalia went off into the woods, and she went looking. She looked high and she looked low. She hoped for frozen apples, and somehow her path still, despite her efforts otherwise, brought her back to the men sitting around the fire. And this time, they didn't even ask. They didn't even ask how they could help. They just insisted that they would help. And she stood by the fire and she asked for the apples. And the old man with the longest beard said, Brother October, I believe you can help us. And Brother October stood and waved his hands, and a clearing grew, and a tree shot up from that, and apples bloomed from the tree. And Natalia grabbed as many as she could in her apron, which when you're talking about apples, it's not that many. And she went back to see Draga. And Draga ate those apples in a way that disgusted her sister. She ate them core and all, just shoving them into her mouth, not offering to share, one after the other. And she ate all of the apples in very little time at all. Less than an hour, she had gone through all of the apples, and she demanded that Natalia go and get her some more. But Natalia, for once, refused her sister. And her sister got so angry that she stormed out of the house. That's not true. Her sister got so angry that she demanded to know where Natalia had gotten the apples, and Natalia gave up and told her. Then she stormed out of the house, and she stormed through the trees, she stormed through the forest, she got all the way towards, she took a direct path. She wasn't trying to avoid it. She took a direct path to see all those men sat around the fire, and she didn't go up very tentatively. Instead, she jumped up onto their platform and demanded, I need more apples. You gave them to my sister? Give them to me. And the man with the longest beard, he stood and he looked to one side, he looked to the other, and he said, Brother December, Brother February, can you help me? And both of those men stood. And Brother January, the man with the longest beard, he began to move his hands, and the other two men moved their hands with him, and a great storm of wind blew up, and the windstorm began to be filled with snow, and it swept Draga away and off into the air. And then they sat back again around the fire. When Draga didn't come home, her mother went looking for her, and her mother tromped through the forest. She went everywhere she could find, and eventually she stumbled upon this same fire with these same men gathered around it. And they looked at her in pity, and they said, we have nothing for you. Your daughter has been swept away, but now she can terrorize you no longer. And the mother, in great sadness, returned back to where her stepdaughter was waiting and told her what had happened. And over time, although they were sad, they were glad to live without the terror, and they began to get used to their new lives. And they found happiness over time because they learned, as Draga never would, that there is indeed a time for everything, and everything comes in its season. And when you try to rush things, try to force them, you will meet an unfortunate end. But if you can wait till things develop in their own time, then you will find your own happiness. Thank you.